Hello there, everyone. If you're watching this video, then you are part of the TTOR army, an army that is building itself up one subscriber at a time. Now, before we get into the topic of today's video, I'd like to remind all of you watching this a very important PSA. This is Quarter, an open source alt tech alternative to YouTube that I created with the help of my tech friends a few months back. And this particular YouTube alternative, Quarter, is something you should definitely invest into. It is feature rich on a level that only YouTube can rival. It has full HD video uploads, live streaming, free restreaming, public playlists, an easy to use comment moderation system, and it even has features that YouTube doesn't have, like an insight currency called Quarter Bucks that allows you to promote your videos and your channel on the main page of the site. There's also video chat rooms where you can have video calls with friends, family, coworkers, your followers, etc., and you can live stream to your channel from these chat rooms. And there is complete freedom of speech on Quarter as long as it's legal and is allowed by the First Amendment of the United States of America. You can say whatever you want on Quarter. Do whatever you want on Quarter, whether it be gaming, ASMR, vlogs, DIY projects, religion, news and politics, whatever. Whatever you want to talk about on Quarter, you can talk about. So be sure, if you're watching this, to create an account on Quarter, and if you're a content creator, start uploading your videos to Quarter and start promoting it today. Now that we got that PSA out of the way, let's talk about today's topic, which is the atheist YouTuber Paulogia. Now, for some of you who've been following me for a while, you may recall that some time ago, Paulogia put out a video titled, "If I Debated Kent Hovind, Best Evidence for Evolution." In this video, Paulogia lays down some stipulations that would have to be met in order for him to agree to do a debate with Kent Hovind, and then he spends the rest of the video presenting his best, most convincing evidences for evolution that convinced him that atheism and evolution was true. Now, I've already responded to the stipulations that Paulogia laid out in my video titled Paulogia's Stipulations for Debating Kent Hovind Are Self-Contradicting and Censorious. And if you want to see the full details behind that, you should go ahead and check out the link in the description box below, which will take you to the video itself. But before I get around to doing the follow-up video where I actually respond to Paulogia's best evidences for evolution, we need to talk about a recent tweet that Paulogia put out. A tweet that actually shows that everything he has to say about atheism and evolution and a lack of evidence for God's existence and the truthfulness of the biblical worldview. A recent tweet that Paulogia put out proves that all of that is just an intellectual smokescreen. Paulogia actually has a much simpler reason for rejecting God. He doesn't want to be held accountable for his sins by God, and we can prove that here today using Paulogia's own words. Now, a few days ago, the young earth creationist Carl Kirby shared a link to his Rumble channel for Debunked TV episode number 10, which is titled, "Am I Anti-Science If I Do Not Believe My Ancestor is an Ape?" Paulogia responded to this tweet by saying, "Yes. Yes, you are." So naturally, because I came across this, I made a response tweet to Paulogia saying, "So if I refuse to believe in atheistic evolution because it never has and can never be proven true by observational science, then I'm anti-science, LOLs. It's amazing the stupid positions atheists will hold to in order to avoid being held accountable for their sins by God." Now, why did I throw in that last part about atheists like Paulogia going to absurd lengths and holding stupid positions in order to avoid being held accountable for their sins by God? Well, before I responded to this tweet, Paulogia put out a tweet earlier that day saying, "Reminder that if God doesn't exist, then neither does sin. Don't fall for guilt tactics." Oh ho ho! Well, now we get some real insight into Paulogia's heart and why he holds the worldview that he does, and he makes the censorious, authoritarian, stupid arguments that he does. The reason why Paulogia makes these arguments is because he doesn't want to be held accountable for his sins. Now, how does this tweet by Paulogia prove that he doesn't want to be held accountable for his sins? Well, it's really quite simple. Sin is simply a crime that you commit against God. You can either commit the crime against God directly, or you can commit it against him indirectly by committing a sin against another human being. And as far as what a sin is, there's all kinds of things that qualify as sin according to the biblical worldview. Way too much and far too much for us to have time to go through in this video. But the basic understanding of sin is that it's a crime you commit against God, and you can either do it directly against God or indirectly against God. But, as Paulogia points out, if God doesn't exist, then neither does sin. Because after all, a sin is a crime you commit against God. But if there's no God to commit a crime against, then obviously sin is fictitious. It doesn't really exist. And what's the ultimate implication of all this? Well, if there is no God, and there is no crime against God to be committed, i.e. no sin, then obviously there's no creator God who's going to hold people like Paulogia accountable for the crimes that he commits against him after he's done living his life on earth. This avoidance of being held accountable for their sins by God is at the heart of most atheists' attacks on God's character, especially when atheists pull out the, God ordered the destruction of the Canaanites and God flooded the world, committing mass genocide. What they always ignore, or if they don't ignore, they certainly don't want you to know, is that the people that God allowed these horrible things to happen to, as a judgment against them, is that these people were horrible. The Canaanites in particular were into child sacrifice and sex with animals and all kinds of incest, in addition to homosexuality and everything else under the sun. So that's why God had the Israelites drive the Canaanites out of the Holy Land. And when you read Genesis and Exodus, you find out that the Canaanites were actually given over 400 years by God to repent of their crimes against him and get into right relationship with him. And they gave him the middle finger those entire 400 plus years. So God eventually decided enough is enough, time to judge these people. Same thing with the pre-flood world and the people on it. After the Nephilim came down and taught people all kinds of disgusting sins to commit, humanity became twisted and evil, and God had to judge the world for what it had become and for the crimes that it had committed against him and other people. That's why he sent the flood. It wasn't an arbitrary decision on God's part. He not only was judging people for the horrible crimes they were committing against him and other people, but he also was trying to preserve the human genome, which was being corrupted by the Nephilim that were on the earth during that time. The Nephilim, of course, if you read the book of Enoch, were half angel, half human hybrids that were the offspring of the angels that came down and mated with human women, which is not just written in the book of Enoch, it's also confirmed in Genesis chapter 6. The problem that these atheists face is that they really want to commit some sins against God and other people, but they know that they can't justify their sins if they acknowledge that God exists and that sin is a real thing, because then they would be forced to acknowledge that God is going to hold them accountable for how they choose to live their lives in rebellion against him. So in order to soothe their conscience, what they do is they deny that God exists, and then they deny that sin exists. And by denying that these two things exist, well then, there is no one who's going to hold them accountable for the things that they do and the way that they choose to live their life. This is how atheists can justify being double-minded hypocrites who have major double standards. This is why atheists and evolutionists can condemn Christians and creationists for the very same things that evolutionists themselves do. This is why evolutionists and atheists will hold standards to God that they wouldn't dare hold to anyone or anything else, especially themselves. They do this because they don't want to be held accountable for their sins, and so, if they delude themselves into thinking that God doesn't exist and sin doesn't exist, and therefore there's no one who's going to hold them accountable for the way they live their life after they die, well, then they can get away and do just about anything, no matter how evil it is, no matter how hypocritical it is, no matter how double-minded it is, no matter how much of a loser it makes them look like. They're all winners in their heads because they've soothed their conscience and they've deluded themselves into thinking that everything's good. As a matter of fact, it is so bad that atheists and evolutionists will tell you that even if you can prove that the biblical worldview is true and that the atheistic evolutionary worldview is false, they still won't accept the biblical worldview and they will still reject the God of the Bible. If you don't believe me, well, let me give you just one example of this, even though I could give you more than one. I have here a video from Germania titled, Why I Don't Argue Against Classical Theism or Creationism, Atheist. And it is at the 10-minute and 31-second mark of this video where we see Germania say the following.
In hell, even if theistic arguments for God convinced me that there was a God, and even if evolution was non-scientific garbage, none of that would lead me to believe in the God of the Bible, because, well, the Bible itself prevents me from believing it.
So, according to Mr. Germania, even if you could convince him that God exists, and even if you could convince him that his atheistic evolutionary worldview is total garbage, he would refuse to believe in the biblical worldview and submit to the God of the Bible. And the reason why he does this, if you watch his entire video, is because of the things you read in the Bible. Things like contradictions in the Bible, and like all atheists who want to avoid being held accountable for their sins, he portrays God as an evil, genocidal monster. Now, the reason why atheists are so obsessed with, one, denying God's existence, and two, portraying him as a genocidal monster, is because if they acknowledge that God is pure and good and has no evil in him at all, and he's infinitely better than us in every way, morally and otherwise, if we acknowledge that as atheists, then you'd be forced to acknowledge that your rejection of God and rebellion against him is futile and stupid, and you're not justified in doing it. But if you can make God look like an evil, genocidal monster, then you'll seem like a good guy by comparison, and therefore your rejection of God and your rebellion against him is justified. It's kind of like how when someone is in a relationship with somebody and the person they're with, they have a good relationship with, but then they run across someone else that they'd rather be in a relationship with, but they don't have a good reason to justify breaking up with their current partner because of how nice and good that partner has been to them. They will then start engaging in major fault finding, start to pick fights with the partner they're currently with, and basically they'll create drama and they'll create tension and they'll create strife where there previously was none in order to justify breaking up with their partner so that they can go do their own thing. And that own thing in particular is be with this other person they've had their eyes on for a while. This is how human beings treat each other when they want to justify rejecting someone in favor of someone or something else. And surprise, surprise, atheists and evolutionists treat God exactly the same way. So when you see evolutionists and atheists like Paulogia tell you that they reject the biblical worldview because there's no good evidence supporting its truthfulness or God's existence, or they tell you that evolution and atheism is true because there's all this good evidence supporting it, that is all a crock. That is a pack of lies. That is just an intellectual smokescreen. The real reason why people like Paulogia reject the biblical worldview, and the real reason why people like Paulogia accept atheism, evolution, and deep time is because they're trying to avoid being held accountable for their sins. Of course, we know in reality that even if they delude themselves into thinking that God doesn't exist and that therefore sin doesn't exist and that therefore they won't be held accountable for the way they live their life, we know that God does exist, regardless of what they think about it. That we know that sin definitely exists. And we know, based on the biblical worldview, that God is going to hold people like Paulogia accountable for the way that he chose to live his life, regardless of whatever Paulogia thinks about it, regardless if Paulogia denies God's existence or not, whether or not Paulogia denies the existence of sin or not. None of it matters because God exists and he is going to hold Paulogia accountable for his sins, just like he's going to hold every atheist and evolutionist accountable for the sins they have committed against God, both directly and indirectly. The ultimate end goal of the atheist evolutionist attack on Christianity and the Bible and young earth creationism is to justify themselves and to avoid being held accountable for their sins.